Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Thread channel. If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a big thumbs up. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Video Playback. The film unfurls, a window into the life of a character grappling with the relentless march of time and the echoes of past endeavors. We see early glimpses of his formative years, perhaps suggesting an inherent, almost obsessive drive that would later manifest in his professional pursuits. It's the kind of early intensity one associates with those who feel compelled to master their chosen craft. Much like an aspiring musician who spends countless hours honing scales before ever stepping onto a grand stage. His career trajectory is shown to be anything but linear. There are moments of exhilarating ascent, flashes of brilliance where his talent seems undeniable, perhaps reminiscent of a young director capturing lightning in a bottle with a debut feature that redefines a genre. Yet these peaks are often followed by valleys, periods of stagnation, or perhaps professional missteps born from overambition or a momentary lapse in judgment regarding the prevailing cultural currents. This struggle for relevance is a universal theme, one that haunts artists and innovators alike, the fear of becoming a relic in an ever-accelerating world. The narrative frequently circles back to his personal relationships, which seem inextricably linked to his creative output. We witness the complexities of connection, the fragile architecture of intimacy built against the backdrop of demanding professional life. One gets the sense that his personal life often served as both muse and antagonist, fueling his best work while simultaneously demanding sacrifices he was ill-equipped to make consistently. It brings to mind the classic struggle of great novelists or composers whose intense focus on their art often left little room for sustained domestic harmony. A significant portion of the viewing experience focuses on a particular project or endeavor that defines this stage of his life. This venture appears fraught with internal conflict, pitting his artistic vision against the commercial realities of his industry. The pressure mounts, illuminated by scenes where the sheer weight of expectation seems almost physical. This mirrors the tension seen in the biographies of legendary studio heads or pioneering screenwriters forced to compromise their original, often audacious, concepts for broader market appeal. As the film progresses, there's a noticeable shift in perspective. The protagonist begins to reflect, perhaps inspired by a chance encounter or a revisiting of old journals. This introspection isn't sentimental. Rather, it's a sober assessment of choices made and paths forgone. It speaks to the realization that mastery is not a destination, but a continuous negotiation with oneself. We see subtle nods to the influences that shaped him, perhaps a brief reference to a mentor whose unorthodox teaching methods fundamentally altered his approach to problem solving, or a pivotal film from his youth that instilled in him a specific aesthetic sensibility. The climax isn't necessarily a grand explosion of success or failure, but rather an internal resolution. He finds a measure of peace, not by achieving some external benchmark, but by redefining what success means to him personally, perhaps embracing the imperfections that his earlier self so desperately tried to eradicate. It's the quiet victory of self-acceptance, the kind of ending that suggests the real performance isn't on the screen or stage, but in the steady, unglamorous act of continuing to create, informed by every triumph and every stumble along the way. The protagonist carries the weight of his former self like a bespoke, slightly ill-fitting suit. We sense the lingering phantom limb sensation of roles he might have taken, The unwritten scores, the unpainted canvases of ambition left behind in the relentless pursuit of what he thought was the right path. His early successes, those dazzling initial eruptions of genius that made industry veterans sit up and take notice, weren't just luck. They were the predictable outcome of an almost monastic dedication. He possessed that frightening clarity of purpose often seen in prodigies, the kind of singular focus that makes trivialities like social grace seem utterly expendable. This initial fire, however, also baked in a certain rigidity, a refusal to pivot gracefully when the winds of taste inevitably shifted. His interaction with collaborators often betray this underlying tension. There's a residual stiffness in his posture when dealing with younger talents, perhaps representatives of the new guard whose very existence seems to challenge the methodologies he fought so hard to establish as canonical. One can almost hear the unspoken defense of his own hard-won techniques, techniques that might have served a previous generation perfectly, but now feel cumbersome in the faster, more digitally fluid environment he navigates poorly. It reminds one of that renowned composer who struggled to incorporate synthesized elements into his later symphonies, clinging to the resonance of acoustic perfection while the world embraced electronic textures. The film beautifully captures the quiet desperation inherent in artistic aging, the need to prove that relevance isn't solely tethered to novelty. His personal losses, hinted at through faded photographs or unoccupied spaces in his home, become potent, if unspoken, subtexts in his later work. These aren't melodramatic breakdowns, but rather the slow erosion of connection caused by prioritizing the ephemeral demands of production over the sustaining requirements of human bonding. He is haunted not by ghosts, but by absences, the silence where shared laughter or simple companionship should reside. When examining his influences, the narrative subtly steers us toward a deep appreciation for craftsmanship over mere spectacle. He seems to channel the spirit of those early auteurs, those who battled studio systems not for fame, but for the integrity of the frame, the unadulterated sound mix. Yet, in his current struggles, he finds himself embodying the very compromises he once railed against, a bitter irony that sharpens the emotional landscape of the story. His current project is less about making a hit and more about extracting some last vestige of personal truth before the industry decides his voice is merely historical footnote material. The final moments offer a fragile, earned sense of peace. It's not the triumph of a blockbuster or a critical darling. It's the quiet dignity of a man who has finally learned to negotiate with his own limitations. He looks at his older works not with judgment, but with a kind of empathetic distance, acknowledging the young man who needed to be so fiercely protective of his vision. This resolution suggests that true enduring artistry lies not in escaping the passage of time, but in learning to incorporate its scars into the ongoing, messy process of creation, making the next note or frame richer for all the notes and frames that came before. The protagonist's solitude is palpable, an atmosphere thickened by years of self-imposed isolation, the kind that settles deep into the upholstery of expensive, yet sterile living spaces. He moves through these rooms less like an owner and more like a curator of his own diminishing legacy. His gestures are economical, practiced movements honed by the thousands of hours spent staring at monitors or pacing sound stages, actions that prioritize efficiency over expression in his off hours. There is a distinct weariness in the set of his shoulders, a physical manifestation of defending an artistic territory that few people still visit. His relationship with memory is complex. It's a meticulously organized archive he both reveres and resents. He recalls the heady days of breakthrough, perhaps an early success that garnered international acclaim, drawing comparisons to the meteoric rise of a visionary filmmaker whose first few pictures defined an aesthetic decade. But now, those memories serve as benchmarks against which his current output inevitably falls short, at least in the eyes of a perpetually hungry public demanding reinvention. This internal pressure manifests in a subtle but persistent tremor in his hands when reading reviews, a tiny physical betrayal of his otherwise iron control. The film hints at a past romantic entanglement, a partnership that fractured under the strain of his singular focus. We see fleeting echoes of this woman, perhaps a brief, vibrant scene in a dimly lit cafe from decades past, juxtaposed against the empty space beside him at a formal industry dinner in the present. It suggests a pattern common among those driven by an all-consuming artistic imperative. They excel at constructing fictional worlds, but lack the foundational scaffolding for sustaining the real ones. His inability to fully commit, to prioritize presence over production, becomes the silent tragedy underscoring his professional triumphs. In his interactions with younger proteges, the emotional temperature drops noticeably. He offers technical advice with crystalline precision, detailing lighting ratios or narrative pacing with the authority of scripture, but often entirely misses the emotional context the younger generation operates within. It's the struggle of the master craftsman confronting the machine age. He knows how to carve the finest detail by hand, while his successors are designing entire structures digitally. His inability to connect on an emotional or cultural level outside the immediate demands of the project creates a widening gulf, reinforcing his isolation. He seeks disciples, but cultivates only cautious apprentices. The climax of his current endeavor is less about box office returns and more about a moment of genuine vulnerability captured on film, a moment he almost cut, fearing it exposed too much of the very brokenness he's spent a lifetime obscuring. It's in this accidental or barely permitted glimpse of authentic human frailty that the film finds its emotional core. This act of reluctant self-exposure feels analogous to a celebrated author finally abandoning postmodern cleverness to write a brutally honest memoir. In that final scene, as he watches the footage, there is no triumphant smile, only a slow, heavy blinking, suggesting the profound exhaustion that follows the difficult but necessary act of finally laying down one's armor. He hasn't won back his youth or erased his regrets, but he has for a brief moment made something truthful again. The aftermath of that small, almost accidental moment of truth settles over him like a fine layer of dust, revealing the contours of his existence more clearly than any meticulously planned grand statement ever could. The industry's reaction is predictably muted. The younger critics, schooled in flashier narratives, treat it as a curiosity, a minor tremor in the seismic activity of current entertainment. He observes their detachment not with anger, but with a kind of quiet understanding that borders on pity. He recognizes the hungry gaze of the young, the insatiable need to devour the past, to clear space for their own ascendance, a cycle he himself participated in decades prior with ruthless efficiency. His remaining energy seems now redirected toward preservation, an almost archaeological effort to safeguard the essence of his methods. We see him engaging in sessions with archivists, not necessarily to document his fame, but to ensure the integrity of the physical materials, the camera negatives, the original musical scores, annotated with his furious pencil marks. This obsession with the artifact speaks to a deep-seated fear that the spirit of his craft, the tactile reality of creation before total digitization, will vanish entirely, leaving behind only soulless replicas. It echoes the dedication of that famous early photographer who insisted on developing his own prints in a makeshift darkroom long after labs offered faster services, valuing the slow chemical process as integral to the final image. His domestic sphere, always a casualty of his career, now reflects a curious truce with loneliness. He begins to cultivate small rituals of unexpected beauty, a perfect cup of tea, brewed exactly to the temperature documented in a long-forgotten travel journal, the tending of a single, resilient bonsai tree requiring meticulous daily attention. These small acts of creation require no audience, no budget negotiations, and offer immediate, unarguable satisfaction. They are small acts of rebellion against the grand, messy, often compromised nature of his large-scale professional life. The film eventually portrays him revisiting a location central to his earliest breakthrough, perhaps an unassuming workshop or a sparsely furnished apartment where necessity forced innovation. Standing there now, surrounded by the silence of history, rather than the clamor of production, he allows himself a moment of unguarded emotion. It is not nostalgia for the struggle, but a deep respect for the clarity of vision that existed before the complications of success layered themselves on top. He sees the young man who was terrified of failure, but utterly fearless in trying, a dichotomy that his older self now understands, but can no longer easily inhabit. Ultimately, the closing imagery offers a sense of cessation rather than conclusion. He is seen walking away from the familiar machinery of his former life, perhaps towards a landscape entirely removed from the studio lots and projection rooms. There is a subtle relaxation in his stride. The constant state of defensive alertness has lessened. The narrative doesn't promise a vibrant new chapter, but rather a peaceful winding down, suggesting that the greatest artistic achievement in a life defined by relentless striving might simply be the ability to finally, gracefully, stop striving, acknowledging that the work, flawed and magnificent as it was, is finished. The final departure is marked by an almost monastic shedding of excess baggage. He doesn't leave with fanfare or a public announcement. Rather, the process is an internal streamlining, much like a dedicated poet ruthlessly editing a lifetime of drafts down to the single essential volume. The few items he takes with him, a worn, leather-bound book, perhaps a specific tool of his trade that defies digital replacement, and a small, unpretentious piece of art, suggest a final prioritization of essence over acquisition. This selection speaks volumes about what he ultimately valued: tangible connection to the process, quiet contemplation, and perhaps a single, irreplaceable memory that grounded his often abstract existence. In these closing sequences, his face, once a mask of professional calculation, seems to relax into the landscape around him. The sharp angles carved by years of decision-making soften, revealing a vulnerability he guarded fiercely when in the public eye. This physical transformation mirrors his emotional release, the relentless need to outperform, to rebut critics, or to prove his enduring genius has finally evaporated. It's the look of a man who has paid his dues, not just to the industry, but to his own demanding internal taskmaster. The decision to move away from the epicenters of his career, the bustling cities, the high-stakes meeting rooms, is portrayed as a necessary act of self-preservation. He seems to be seeking a place where his name holds no currency, where his past accolades are irrelevant to the rhythm of the local community. This deliberate anonymity is itself a final, powerful, creative choice, a retreat from the spotlight that both fed and consumed him. We sense a man seeking the mundane as a form of final purification, trading the roar of the crowd for the whisper of the wind. His final engagement with a former peer, perhaps a brief phone call or a sparsely worded letter, reveals a newfound capacity for forgiveness, both for others who misunderstood his work and, crucially, for himself. The rigid perfectionist of his youth is finally granted amnesty. This is not a surrender to mediocrity, but an embrace of the human condition. Art is born of struggle, and a life lived intensely will inevitably bear scars. The film suggests that true maturity arrives when the artist recognizes that their greatest contribution was not the finished product, but the integrity of the long, arduous journey itself. The very last image lingers, not on a grand vista, but on a small, repetitive action he undertakes in his new, quieter environment, perhaps tending a fire or observing the tide. It is an action devoid of stakes, yet wholly present. This final scene implies that life, stripped of professional ambition, continues to offer its own subtle forms of composition. The narrative concludes by asserting that the legacy isn't truly in the museum prints or the historical retrospectives, but in the quiet, everyday rhythm established after the final curtain falls, a life lived fully, if imperfectly, up until the very end. The tranquility he finds in these final, simple actions is hard-won, a fragile peace balanced against decades of internal warfare waged over artistic integrity. This newfound simplicity acts as a quiet counterpoint to the elaborate, often baroque, narratives he once constructed for the screen. He handles the mundane tasks with the same meticulous attention he once applied to framing a pivotal close-up, yet the stakes are profoundly different. Here, the consequence of error is only a slightly imperfect cup of tea, not a career setback threatening millions of dollars and reputations. It is the ultimate act of shifting control from the external, often chaotic world of finance and public opinion to the immediate, controllable sphere of his own hands. His appreciation for the natural world now seems to mirror the aesthetics he once strived for in his visuals: clarity, texture, and the beauty found in unavoidable decay. The way light falls across an aged wooden surface or the pattern of moss on a stone wall holds more fascination than any complex special effect could muster now. This is the wisdom of someone who has seen the limits of human artifice and turned back toward the enduring, unscripted artistry of existence itself. Much like a master painter who, after years of working with vibrant, manufactured pigments, finds profound inspiration in the subtle chiaroscuro of twilight. There are moments, fleeting but sharp, when the old anxieties resurface. Perhaps while hearing a news report about a contemporary artist achieving a massive success with a project he himself once dismissed as shallow, a familiar tightness grips his chest. These flickers are not regrets about turning down a certain path, but rather a momentary human yearning for the recognition that validates the sacrifice. However, these moments pass quickly, broken by the steady, grounding presence of his isolation, which now serves not as a prison, but as a necessary shield against the incessant demand for performance. He understands that the desire for validation is the first trap that ensnares the ambitious young artist, and escaping it is the final, hardest won, creative freedom. He occasionally reviews his old scripts, not to critique them, but almost to commune with the younger, fiercely opinionated man who wrote them. He sees the flaws now, the overwrought monologues, the reliance on shock value, but also recognizes the pure, untainted urgency that drove those pages. It is a detached affection, akin to reading the diary of an intense, slightly misguided relative. He acknowledges that the very hubris of that younger self was essential for pushing past conventional boundaries, a necessary engine for the breakthroughs he achieved. In the final analysis, the film portrays a closing chapter where the protagonist achieves a form of personal redemption not measured by awards or box office receipts, but by silence. He has managed to quiet the internal editor that dictated his every move for decades. The landscape he inhabits is vast and indifferent to his past status, forcing him into a humility that success never allowed. The true victory rests in the quiet realization that he is no longer defined by what he creates, but simply by the fact that he is. A conclusion earned through a lifetime spent chasing definitions that perpetually moved just beyond his grasp. The protagonist's final environment is strikingly minimalist, deliberately devoid of the opulent clutter that once signified his success. The few possessions retained speak to utility and permanence, a quiet rebellion against the ephemeral nature of his former trade, where yesterday's masterpiece is today's historical footnote. This physical stripping away mirrors a deeper psychological divestment. A deliberate severing of identity ties to the industry machine that both elevated and nearly consumed him. One senses a man finally comfortable existing outside the frame of expectation, much like a pioneering composer who, after perfecting complex orchestral works, finds deep satisfaction in the pure, unadorned resonance of a single, well-tuned cello note. His engagement with the outside world is minimal, curated by necessity rather than preference. Communication, when it occurs, is brief and factual, devoid of the elaborate rhetorical maneuvering that characterized his professional negotiations. He seems uninterested in imparting grand lessons, perhaps understanding that true wisdom cannot be transferred via anecdote or lecture. It must be forged in the furnace of personal experience. This restraint is noticeable, especially when contrasted with the early film footage where he was eager, almost aggressive, in asserting his vision, fueled by the desperate need to prove himself right against every skeptic. A particularly moving sequence involves his interaction with an unexpected visitor, perhaps a distant relative or a long-forgotten acquaintance, who treats him without any deference to his celebrated past. This visitor sees only an older man tending a garden or reading by a window, entirely unaware of the cinematic empires he once commanded. This mundane acceptance is profoundly liberating for the protagonist. For the first time in decades, he is judged not on his last completed project, but on the simple quality of his present demeanor. It is an emotional balm that years of critical acclaim could never quite deliver. The film subtly emphasizes that his greatest legacy might reside in the failures he learned from, rather than the celebrated triumphs. The difficult, messy productions that nearly broke him, the compromises that stung his pride, are now viewed with a strange tenderness. These moments of near defeat were the crucibles where resilience was forged, teaching him a deeper, more nuanced understanding of narrative structure than any easy success could have provided. It is the hard-won knowledge that perfection is an illusion, and vitality lies in the flawed execution of a deeply held belief. As the screen fades, the sense is not one of final defeat or ultimate vindication, but of equilibrium. He has navigated the treacherous waters of genius, ego, and industry pressure, and arrived at a shore where the only remaining objective is authenticity in the smallest moments. The soundscape accompanying the final moments reflects this shift. The loud, driving score of his earlier career is replaced by ambient sounds. The distant call of a bird, the gentle creak of old wood, the sound of his own steady breathing. It is a quiet, profound endorsement of a life lived to its fullest capacity, acknowledging that the greatest performance is simply living out the final act with grace and honesty. The protagonist's gaze, once sharp enough to dissect a scene's flaws in a single sweep, now rests on the horizon with an almost meditative softness. There's a deep satisfaction in relinquishing the pretense of control over the world outside his immediate vicinity. He no longer feels the obligation to wrestle meaning from chaos. Instead, he accepts the inherent randomness, finding a strange comfort in the fact that the weather, the migratory patterns of birds, or the growth rate of his small patch of earth will proceed entirely independent of his directorial approval. This acceptance is perhaps the hardest earned lesson, far more challenging than mastering the complex technical specifications of film production. His physical existence simplifies to accommodate this newfound internal quiet. The expensive suits are replaced by durable, undyed fabrics that require no specific care or statement. His diet, once dictated by the irregular, high-energy demands of long production schedules, fueled by adrenaline and catered convenience, becomes rooted in local seasonality, reflecting a commitment to the immediate environment. This grounding in the physical reality of sustenance contrasts sharply with the constructed realities he spent his life manufacturing. It recalls the purposeful simplicity adopted by certain celebrated writers in their later years, who retreated from literary society to rediscover the elemental connection between the hand, the thought, and the raw material. The few possessions he keeps serve as tactile anchors to moments of genuine human connection rather than professional milestones. A poorly drawn postcard from a long-estranged sibling, perhaps, or a simple smooth stone found on a forgotten beach, these objects hold more emotional weight than any preserved statuette or award plaque. He has successfully separated the person from the persona, allowing the celebrated figure to recede while the quieter, more flawed human being remains, finally unburdened by the need to maintain a public myth. There is a recurring, gentle melancholy associated with the echoes of his former ambition. It's not regret, but a wistful recognition of the sheer, almost reckless energy required to climb to the heights he once occupied. He understands now that much of that energy was channeled not into making better art, but into fighting the systemic forces, the studio executives, the fickle press, the internal doubts that sought to contain or diminish him. He is grateful for the battles that shaped his technique, but relieved that the war is over. The final moments of the film suggest a quiet integration into the continuity of life, rather than a dramatic finale. There is no great pronouncement, no final interview setting the record straight. Instead, the camera holds on him performing an ordinary, unobserved action, mending a broken fence post, perhaps. His movements are slow, deliberate, infused with the wisdom of long experience, yet utterly lacking in urgency. The message conveyed is clear. The ultimate artistic achievement is to find peace within the unremarkable flow of being, long after the world has stopped watching and waiting for the next performance. The story concludes on the dignity of rest, earned through a life intensely lived. The protagonist's acceptance of the unremarkable is deeply intertwined with a newfound, almost spiritual appreciation for negative space, both visually and existentially. Having spent a career filling every frame, every minute of dialogue, every potential silence with intention. He now cherishes the quiet voids. The expanse of an empty field, viewed from his window, holds the same compositional weight as a perfectly blocked scene in his prime. Only now, the negative space speaks of freedom rather than opportunity yet to be seized. This shift in visual language reflects a mastery over his own internal landscape, finally allowing for gaps where ego once rushed to fill the void. His interactions, though rare, carry an unexpected depth because they are entirely stripped of agenda. When he speaks, there is no subtext related to promotion, negotiation, or legacy management. This unburdened communication surprises those few he encounters who are prepared to engage with the legend, but are instead confronted by a man acutely present in the moment. It is the authenticity of these final exchanges that suggests a deeper, more enduring influence than any blockbuster ever could. He models for others the difficult art of disengagement from the performance of self. The film hints that his most profound influence may ultimately be the example of his departure. Young creators, perhaps those who once admired his groundbreaking visual style but felt suffocated by his notorious intensity, might look upon his quiet retirement not as a retreat, but as the final, most radical act of creative control. They witnessed someone who dictated the terms of his ascent and, critically, dictated the terms of his conclusion. This subtle power shift, the artist dictating the narrative's end rather than succumbing to industry attrition, is a quiet, powerful lesson for those inheriting the often exploitative structures he once fought within. The weariness that previously marked his posture has transformed into a kind of settled gravitas. It's the difference between the exhaustion of a long sprint and the enduring patience of a marathon runner nearing the finish line under his own power. His hands, which once flew across editing suites or clutched production notes, now move with a slow, deliberate grace necessary for tasks that require patience over speed, perhaps carving wood or simply turning the pages of an old, unread volume of poetry. These actions are not attempts to create new art, but rather gestures of appreciation for the simple physics of existence. In the ultimate stillness that envelops him, the film finds its resolution. There is no final, grand statement delivered to the camera, no retrospective summation of his impact. Instead, the focus remains purely on his quiet habitation of the present. He has moved beyond the need for external mirrors, criticism, applause, imitation, and has achieved the rare state where the creator and the creation merge into a single, sustained state of being. The narrative closes not on the memory of his cinematic brilliance, but on the enduring, unglamorous quietude of a life finally reconciled with itself. The silence that finally settles around him is not the suffocating silence of creative block, which haunted his mid-career troughs, but a generative quiet, pregnant with acceptance. It is the deep, resonant quiet found only after the loudest inner arguments have been resolved. He has stopped listening for the echoes of past applause or the distant rumbling of future criticism. The only sound that truly registers now is the immediate, unmediated world. This final state feels less like retirement and more like achieving a perfect long exposure photograph of existence, where movement blurs into texture and the sharp edges of ambition have finally softened into contour. His infrequent communication with the outside world, often limited to brief, necessary transactions, reveals an almost Zen-like clarity. He seems incapable now of the small, polite deceptions that lubricate social interaction in the world of fame. If he is asked about his past work, His response is brief and factual, devoid of the protective gloss or defensive justification he once habitually applied. This honesty, so long suppressed by the demands of maintaining a public image, is startling. It suggests that the rigorous self-censorship required to navigate the treacherous politics of success has finally exhausted itself, leaving behind only the unvarnished truth of his experience. The film lingers on the few objects he allows into his sanctuary, noting their worn patina. There is a sense of reverence for things that have endured use, resisting the constant drive for replacement and novelty that characterized his professional sphere. A certain analog recording device, perhaps, or a set of well-worn drafting tools, these artifacts are not symbols of nostalgia, but proof of enduring function. They confirm his final philosophical stance, that true value lies in objects capable of sustaining interaction over time, echoing the endurance of truly great storytelling over transient trends. His solitary walks through the nearby natural areas become his new form of scouting, seeking not locations for dramatic set pieces, but patterns of sustainable growth. He observes how life persists, adapts, and sometimes fails beautifully in the natural environment, offering silent lessons that his carefully structured narratives often missed. This communion with the unscripted world is implicitly contrasted with the highly controlled, high-stakes environments of his former life, where every shadow, every line of dialogue was meticulously bullied into submission. The ultimate emotional climax is not an outward display, but an inward realization during a moment of profound simplicity, perhaps watching a sunset that requires no filter or enhancement. He understands, with sudden, crystalline clarity, that the relentless energy expended in chasing external validation was fundamentally misplaced. The meaning was never located in the finished product, but in the disciplined focus required during the act of creation itself. The final frame emphasizes this quiet liberation. The protagonist is simply sitting, breathing, utterly unconcerned with whether his presence or absence registers on the world's ongoing narrative. He has become his own audience, and the performance, at last, is complete. The protagonist's final repose is characterized by an almost geological slowness, a pace that actively resists the rapid currents of modern life he once sought to master and redirect. His movements now resemble those of an ancient craftsman whose knowledge is embedded not just in his mind, but in the very mechanics of his body, honed over countless repetitions of precise, low-stakes actions. This steadiness is a testament to a profound internal victory, the conquest of his own relentless impatience, the very engine that drove his early, brilliant, but often exhausting career successes. One can picture the younger man, a whirlwind of manic energy famously captured in interviews from his breakthrough period, unable to sit still for more than 5 minutes, constantly sketching storyboards on napkins. This older man now finds solace in the unhurried unfolding of a single morning. His environment reflects this philosophical shift towards enduring substance over fleeting sensation. The few books he keeps close are heavily annotated, showing signs of being read and reread, their pages softened by handling, a stark contrast to the pristine, unread trophies that once lined the shelves of his city apartment. These well-loved volumes suggest a return to primary sources of inspiration, an acknowledgement that the deepest truths often reside in the foundational texts, not in the derivative conversations surrounding the latest industry buzz. It speaks to a man who has consciously chosen depth over breadth, resonance over reach. The emotional temperature of his solitude has stabilized into something warm, like an aged whiskey, rather than the icy sharpness of professional isolation. He seems to have made peace with the necessary compromises that peppered his filmography. The actor he had to fire to save the budget, the scene he fought for, but ultimately watered down for marketability. These memories no longer trigger sharp pangs of guilt, but are recognized as the unavoidable taxes levied by a life lived at scale. He understands that to create anything large enough to impact culture, one must inevitably engage with its messy compromises. When the rare external sound intrudes, the distant drone of an airplane, perhaps, he barely registers it, demonstrating a near total dissociation from the systems that once defined his worth. This indifference is the ultimate marker of his freedom. He is no longer waiting for the phone to ring, no longer anticipating the next review that will either validate or undermine years of focused labor. This liberation from external judgment is precisely what allowed those young prodigies he once mentored to flourish, ironically, by moving on to their own projects, free from the shadow of his overwhelming authority. The film's closing sequence is intentionally muted, focusing on the integrity of his immediate space. There is no cliffhanger, no final cryptic artistic gesture intended for posterity. Instead, there is the simple, undeniable reality of an elderly man existing fully in his time and space. He closes a window against a sudden chill, a small, practical act that requires no narrative justification. This quiet closing reinforces the idea that the greatest art, perhaps, is not the dazzling creation that shocks the world, but the quiet, consistent act of sustaining one's self with integrity until the very end. The screen fades not on a legend, but on a human being who finally managed to edit his own life, down to its most essential, beautiful, and enduring elements. The final, sustained quiet is perhaps the most eloquent statement of his entire career, a perfect analog to the long, sustained chord that ends a truly resonant symphony, not fading into nothingness, but resonating until the air itself seems saturated with its presence. He moves through his remaining days with a deliberate economy of motion, conserving energy not for a final project, but for the simple, day-to-day act of being. His physical presence seems less about imposing will and more about inhabiting space respectfully, much like a guest in a venerable old house who polishes the silver not out of duty, but out of genuine admiration for its history. His mind, once a relentless machine churning out complex narrative permutations, has found new rhythms. He engages in long periods of quiet observation, perhaps watching insects work in the garden, noting their tireless, unself-conscious efficiency. This focus on the small, persistent labors of the natural world serves as a silent antidote to the grand, often artificial dramas he used to orchestrate. He seems to understand, finally, that true momentum is not found in explosive bursts of genius, but in consistent, incremental effort, a concept he'd grasped intellectually for decades, but only now embodies physically. The few sentimental objects he retains are treated not as trophies, but as repositories of effort. A favorite slightly tarnished lens from an old camera, one that produced a specific, sought-after fall-off in focus that modern digital simulations can never quite replicate, is held sometimes in his palm. It's not the resulting image he appreciates in that moment, but the tangible relationship between glass, light, and time, the sheer craft of it. This tactile connection to the material reality of his past work is his final link to the man who needed to wrestle beauty from physical resistance. He exhibits an unexpected gentleness toward his own aging body, recognizing it as the final, most stubborn collaborator he has ever had. Where the younger man would have ruthlessly pushed past exhaustion, viewing fatigue as a moral failing, the elder statesman acknowledges its necessity. This acceptance of physical limitation feels like the ultimate surrender of ego. The body demands its due, and in granting it, he is free from the tyranny of perpetual performance. In the very last moments implied by the narrative silence, there is a suggestion that he might finally be ready to conceptualize something entirely new, but not for an audience. Perhaps it is merely an arrangement of stones in his garden or a rhythm tapped out softly on a wooden table. This final, unrecorded creative impulse is entirely self-contained, a pure act of expression undertaken for the simple satisfaction of arranging matter according to an internal, perfect, and utterly private design. The film leaves us with the impression that the protagonist has successfully navigated the perilous journey from seeking external immortality through art to finding quiet, enduring existence within himself. The flickering, often grainy quality of the footage immediately establishes a sense of found material, a window into an event not initially intended for public consumption. This raw intimacy, inherent in amateur or archival recordings, shapes the viewer's relationship with the narrative, compelling an almost anthropological scrutiny of the actions unfolding on screen. The director, whose earlier works often explored the blurred lines between documentary truth and constructed reality, perhaps recalling the influence of early cinema verite practitioners like the Maysles brothers, who meticulously framed the mundane as profound, utilizes this aesthetic deliberately. The central figure, whose presence dominates the frame, exhibits a performative vulnerability that feels both deeply authentic and carefully managed. One can sense the actor's background, perhaps rooted in stage or improvisational theater, given the fluid, reactive nature of their expressions. This is an individual comfortable being observed, yet clearly struggling with the confines of the situation being documented. Their mannerisms echo the intensity seen in performers who trained under figures emphasizing Stanislavski's system, where emotional recall is paramount. Yet here, the external pressure seems to force an unfiltered eruption rather than a calculated memory. Consider the environmental context. The muted color palette, dominated by blues and grays, suggests either low-light conditions or a digital capture struggling with dynamic range, a technical limitation that paradoxically enhances the verisimilitude. It places the viewer not in a curated cinematic space, but in a specific, uncomfortable location. If we examine the careers of the supporting individuals, often comprised of lesser-known character actors, there's a palpable sense of being caught off guard, their reactions lacking the practiced polish of lead performers. This disparity creates friction, the lead actor striving for control, while the environment and secondary figures actively dismantle that illusion. The pacing of the sequence analyzed is deliberately uneven. Long stretches of near stasis are broken by sudden, sharp bursts of activity or dialogue. This rhythm deliberately mirrors the halting nature of real-life crises, where anticipation often outweighs actual events. The influence here seems less about classical Hollywood structure and more akin to the observational style favored by certain European New Wave directors who prioritized mood and atmosphere over plot mechanics. The director appears interested in sustained tension, allowing discomfort to steep rather than resolve quickly. Furthermore, the sound design, or lack thereof, plays a crucial role. Background noise, perhaps traffic or distant human chatter, is present but never intrusive, suggesting an attempt to capture an auditory verite. This meticulous layering or careful stripping away of sound directs focus squarely onto the vocal performance, magnifying every strained breath or murmured aside. For an actor whose resume might show a history of meticulous vocal training, perhaps drawing from radio drama or voiceover work, this close mic placement becomes both a tool for expression and a source of inescapable exposure. The film ultimately succeeds not by offering clear answers, but by trapping the audience within the same uncomfortable observation loop imposed upon the participants. The inherent ambiguity surrounding the precise nature of the event being documented fuels much of the psychological tension. We are observing a crucible, but the nature of the fire remains unstated, forcing the audience to project their own anxieties onto the unfolding scene. This mirrors the structural devices employed by directors who built careers on existential dread, where the threat is always implied rather than explicitly shown, much like the undercurrents of alienation found in early independent cinema focused on urban isolation. The lead figure's eyes, when briefly caught by a direct light source, convey a profound weariness that transcends simple exhaustion. It speaks to a sustained emotional expenditure, perhaps recalling the intense preparation required of method actors who immerse themselves completely in roles of moral ambiguity. There is a flicker there, a momentary breakdown of the practiced facade, suggesting an internal monologue fighting against the necessity of external composure. This individual's career history might reveal a pattern of gravitating toward roles involving significant internal conflict, perhaps learning to harness that instability as a source of creative power. Notice the subtle, nonverbal communication exchange between the primary subject and a secondary figure positioned just outside the immediate focal plane. This glance, lasting barely a second, is loaded with unspoken history, a shared secret, or a mutual acknowledgement of the performance they are both currently engaged in, albeit for different reasons. The secondary figure, perhaps a relative newcomer whose background leans toward commercial work, emphasizing quick, readable, emotional cues, struggles to maintain the naturalistic veneer expected in this environment. Their slightly exaggerated posture betrays the effort involved in mimicking genuine distress, creating a fascinating counterpoint to the lead's seemingly effortless immersion. The composition, despite the low fidelity capture, exhibits a strange formality. Objects within the frame, a piece of furniture slightly off-center, a door frame dominating one edge, act as visual anchors, creating cages around the subjects. This deliberate framing suggests the director's architectural sensibility, a belief that environment dictates behavior. It moves beyond simple surveillance. It becomes a deliberate, almost painterly arrangement of human figures within a constrained space, reminiscent of psychological dramas where the setting itself acts as an antagonist, putting pressure on the characters to react in predetermined yet emotionally fraught ways. The lingering shots on these inanimate details force the viewer to confront the quietude between the dramatic peaks, highlighting the heavy silence that follows moments of high intensity. The textural quality of the image, thick with a visual noise, actively works against any tendency toward slick detachment. It forces a tactile engagement. The viewer feels as though they could reach out and smudge the very air surrounding the characters. This immersion is not comfortable. It's abrasive, reflecting the emotional abrasiveness of the situation itself. The director's dedication to this unvarnished aesthetic likely stems from a profound distrust of manufactured smoothness, possibly influenced by the stark realism sought by documentarians, chronicling societal underbellies where glamour is an unaffordable luxury. The central protagonist's physicality, even when still, vibrates with contained energy. There's a subtle tremor in the hands, barely perceptible unless one is actively looking for signs of duress, a hallmark of an actor who has spent considerable time studying human anxiety, perhaps through years of working in emotionally demanding theatrical roles that require prolonged physical manifestation of inner turmoil. This is not melodrama. It is the visible cost of sustained emotional pressure made manifest in the body. Their clothing, nondescript and slightly rumpled, further distances them from any constructed stardom, rooting them firmly in the immediate, poorly lit reality of the recording. When dialogue finally surfaces, it is often delivered in near monotone, an unusual choice that suggests either emotional shutdown or an extreme effort to control inflection, lest a single stray word betray a deeper narrative truth. This vocal restraint is the antithesis of the explosive theatrical monologues often prized in dramatic training. Instead, it channels the quiet desperation found in espionage thrillers or tense courtroom dramas where every syllable carries immense weight. The effectiveness lies in what is withheld, leaving the audience to fill the gaps with their worst assumptions. The secondary characters orbiting the main figure serve a crucial, albeit passive, narrative function. One individual, consistently positioned in the periphery, offers minimal reaction. A tight nod here, a slight turning away there. This studied passivity suggests a profound discomfort with the spotlight, perhaps belonging to someone whose professional life, prior to this, involved behind-the-scenes roles, such as a skilled script supervisor or continuity expert, whose training emphasized meticulous observation without participation. Their very stillness acts as a mirror, reflecting the severity of the lead's crisis back onto them. Ultimately, the film functions as an exercise in sustained empathetic claustrophobia. By refusing the expected visual cues of resolution or narrative relief, the director maintains the pressure cooker environment. It is a study in the architecture of consequence, demonstrating how environments, lighting choices, and the presence of unscripted witnesses combine to strip agency from the subject. The resulting viewing experience is less about witnessing a story unfold and more about enduring a prolonged, shared moment of profound, documented exposure. The very texture of the soundscape, punctuated by unexpected silences, generates a sense of temporal distortion. Time seems to expand and contract based on the lead character's proximity to articulating a painful truth. This uneven rhythm feels intentionally designed to mimic the state of shock, where external reality loses its reliable cadence. For an actor whose prior career might have involved scoring dramatic films, lending their voice to narrations that established consistent pacing, the experience here must be jarring, being forced into the very erratic pulse they once sought to control externally. The primary subject's hands, when they finally move to gesture or adjust their position, betray an almost compulsive need for self-soothing, small, almost invisible adjustments to clothing or hair. These gestures, unconscious products of deep-seated anxiety, are precisely the details that rigorous acting classes often seek to eliminate in favor of externalized performance. Yet here they become the most honest form of communication. This points to a performer who understands the internal landscape intimately, perhaps having studied psychology or spent significant time in therapeutic environments to inform their craft, making the boundary between the role and the self perilously thin. A particular detail of lighting, a single weak lamp, casting elongated, distorted shadows across the background wall, transforms the mundane setting into something expressionistic. This deliberate use of chiaroscuro, a technique often associated with German expressionism, visually underscores the internal conflict. It suggests that the drama is not just happening in the room, but is being projected onto the environment itself. The director, possibly drawing inspiration from filmmakers who used stark lighting to symbolize moral decay or psychological fracturing, leverages this visual device to amplify the feeling of being watched by an unseen, judgmental force. The supporting cast's reactions, or lack thereof, further indict the situation. One individual, constantly positioned behind the lead, but slightly out of focus, possesses a gaze that is unnervingly fixed. This person's consistent, unblinking observation hints at a role of silent enforcement or deep, unwavering loyalty, perhaps an associate whose career background involved high-stakes security or close personal management where emotional neutrality was a survival skill. Their stillness is a form of aggression, creating a wall of passive judgment that the protagonist cannot break through with mere words. The cumulative effect of these cinematic choices, the grainy fidelity, the psychological framing, the constrained emotional expression, is to turn the audience into reluctant voyeurs, forced into a state of profound ethical discomfort. We are not enjoying a spectacle, we are witnessing an erosion. The film demands that we actively participate in the interpretation of distress, recognizing that the most telling moments occur not in the shouts, but in the near imperceptible physical tells of a person whose carefully constructed reality is collapsing under the weight of documentation. It is a testament to the director's skill that such a deliberately unpolished presentation achieves a resonance far deeper than high-definition artifice ever could. The camera movement, when it occurs, is minimal and hesitant, suggesting the operator is either physically constrained or deeply hesitant to intrude further upon the unfolding event. This near stillness contrasts sharply with the internalized kinetic energy of the main subject. If the cameraman were a seasoned professional, perhaps one who cut their teeth shooting verite documentaries in politically volatile regions, their caution would stem from an acute awareness of risk. Not just physical danger, but the ethical risk of capturing irreversible human vulnerability. This hesitation translates into deliberate framing decisions, often favoring medium-long shots that keep a respectful yet agonizingly visible distance. The protagonist occasionally attempts to bridge this distance through direct address, their gaze momentarily seeking the lens as if it were a confidant or a prosecutor. These moments shatter the illusion of pure observation, acknowledging the presence of the recording apparatus itself. An actor of this caliber, perhaps accustomed to the fourth wall, breaks common in Brechtian theater, understands the power of implicating the viewer. This direct appeal often feels less like a plea for help and more like an intellectual challenge. Can you, the unseen observer, truly process the reality you are demanding to witness? This technique deliberately sabotages the passive consumption of the narrative. The environment itself seems to be subtly shifting in response to the emotional temperature. Subtle changes in the quality of the background murmur or the way dust motes appear illuminated by the weak light source imply that the passage of time within the scene is far longer than the actual runtime suggests. This manipulation of perceived duration is a hallmark of directors who value psychological immersion over linear storytelling, often seen in films that explore trauma, where moments of intense focus stretch indefinitely. The audience begins to anticipate movement in the shadows, projecting potential narrative resolutions onto the inanimate setting. The secondary figure, whose stillness previously denoted passive enforcement, now exhibits a singular, almost imperceptible action, perhaps the slow, deliberate placing of an empty glass on a nearby surface. This action, devoid of urgency yet executed with intense focus, serves to reestablish control in the frame, acting as a quiet counter-narrative to the lead's emotional unraveling. For this supporting player, whose career might be built on precision and timing in technical roles, like film editing, where minute adjustments dictate narrative flow, this small gesture is their statement. It is a reminder that even within chaos, systems and structures of observation remain operational. The film's enduring power lies in its refusal to offer the catharsis that traditional narrative structures promise. We are left suspended, much like the protagonist, in the lingering aftermath of an unspoken climax. The lingering shot on the lead's profile as the footage fades suggests that the documentation and the performance continues beyond the frame's edge, implying that the need to be seen, or the burden of being seen, is not confined to the duration of this recording, but is a permanent state imposed by the act of being captured. The visual texture, often described as video noise, is not merely a flaw of the recording medium, but a deliberate obfuscation, a layer of static that paradoxically clarifies the emotional truth underneath. This deliberate degradation of image quality suggests an aversion to the pristine, calculated look of mainstream cinema, favoring instead the grit associated with early independent producers who operated outside established studio financing and distribution. The director seems to subscribe to the notion that authenticity is inherently messy and resistant to high resolution. The protagonist's breathing pattern, captured in such unnerving proximity, is a study in forced regulation versus instinctual panic. Shallow, quick intakes of air punctuate longer, held exhalations, indicating a high level of sympathetic nervous system activation. This level of physical manifestation suggests the actor has undertaken rigorous research into human stress responses, possibly informed by work alongside movement coaches who specialize in somatic psychology. It's the physical embodiment of fighting an internal battle against collapse, where every muscle group is engaged in maintaining a facade of equilibrium. Consider the implications of the background figure's clothing and grooming. While the lead is purposefully rumpled, the peripheral individuals appear almost too well put together for the apparent urgency of the moment. This stylistic dissonance suggests a hierarchy of engagement. Those observing are detached enough to have maintained their personal presentation, while the subject is too consumed to care. This meticulous contrast draws attention to the asymmetrical power dynamic, those maintaining order versus the one whose order is dissolving. When a sound finally breaks the sustained quiet, perhaps a sharp intake of breath from an observer or the rustle of fabric, it is amplified to the level of a gunshot. This sonic engineering underscores the sensitivity of the environment, where the smallest deviation from silence is deemed significant. The sound mixer, possibly someone whose career focused on acoustic design for immersive theater installations, has treated the ambient noise as a score, using absence and sudden presence to manipulate the viewer's pulse, transforming the setting into a resonant chamber for anxiety. The film refuses any visual shorthand for psychological distress, avoiding close-ups that might feel exploitative. Instead, the framing remains consistent in its medium distance, forcing the viewer to actively piece together the emotional narrative from bodily language and environmental clues. This directorial choice suggests a deep respect for the subject's potential dignity, even while documenting their lowest point, mirroring the ethical considerations often debated among investigative journalists regarding the depiction of suffering. The result is a narrative that demands patience and rewards careful, sustained observation with profound, albeit uncomfortable, insight into the mechanics of human endurance. The subtle yet persistent unevenness in the background focus, where objects in the foreground are critically sharp, while the middle ground recedes into a soft blur, creates a disorienting depth of field. This technique visually enforces the protagonist's tunnel vision. Their immediate crisis is hyper-detailed, while the context surrounding them dissolves into irrelevance or ungraspable threat. For a director whose visual language often references early photographic portraiture, where isolating the subject against an indistinct backdrop was key to conveying psychological isolation, this deliberate visual hierarchy is highly intentional. It mimics the subjective experience of trauma, where peripheral awareness diminishes drastically. The lead character's attempts at self-soothing manifest in repetitive, almost ritualistic actions involving their hands, not just adjusting clothing, but rubbing a specific spot on their wrist or nervously interlocking and then forcefully separating their fingers. These micro-movements speak volumes, suggesting a practiced method of self-regulation learned over years, perhaps from an acting discipline that mandated deep physical embodiment of internal states, contrasting sharply with the raw, uncontrolled emotion breaking through elsewhere. It is the learned mechanism fighting the overwhelming instinct. One specific observer, positioned slightly behind the primary action, never directly engages with the subject, but instead focuses intently on a small, handheld electronic device, a phone or a digital recorder. This figure embodies detached bureaucracy or clinical detachment. Their background might be in technical fields, such as data processing or system administration, where emotional content is filtered out in favor of processing information. Their non-reaction acts as a steady, cold anchor against the emotional turbulence, suggesting that for some present, this crisis is merely data, to be recorded or managed, not experienced. The use of negative space around the figures is crucial. In shots where the subject is centrally framed, the empty wall space above and beside them feels heavy and oppressive, suggesting a ceiling that is too low or walls that are closing in. This is a classic tactic borrowed from expressionistic set design, where architecture physically embodies the character's psychological state. The film isn't just showing a confined space. It is visually constructing a psychological prison around the subject, reinforcing the sense that escape, even in thought, is impossible while the lens is running. When the main figure finally vocalizes something beyond a strained whisper, the delivery is strangely formal, almost declamatory, as if they are reciting lines from a script they only half remember. This performative formality suggests a deep-seated professional conditioning. The actor cannot entirely shed the habits of years spent delivering polished dialogue, even when raw honesty is demanded. This clash between ingrained professional speech patterns and immediate emotional devastation creates a haunting dissonance. The film's ultimate power is derived from watching these carefully built professional skins peel away, layer by uncomfortable layer, leaving behind something deeply exposed and painfully human for the audience to confront without the safety net of conventional cinematic resolution. The quality of the ambient illumination shifts subtly throughout the sequence, moving from a flat, almost clinical fluorescence to a warmer, more golden hue when the protagonist turns slightly toward a specific point off camera. This minor adjustment in light suggests an external intervention, someone adjusting a lamp or perhaps an indicator light changing state, signaling a technical cue that the observers and thus the audience are not meant to acknowledge, yet which profoundly alters the mood. A director who trained under cinematographers obsessed with the psychological implications of light temperature, such as those associated with neo-realist traditions, would use this shift not as a technical necessity, but as an emotional punctuation mark, briefly offering a false sense of solace before the harsher reality returns. The lead actor's physical posture exhibits a fascinating contradiction. The shoulders are slightly hunched in a protective fetal posture, yet the spine remains unnaturally rigid, indicating a tension between the desire to withdraw and the need to remain upright and present for the camera. This internal tug of war is a masterclass in restrained acting, a technique often taught to stage actors who must maintain imposing stage presence while conveying inner turmoil. One can imagine this performer having spent years honing the ability to project outward while maintaining a secret, chaotic core, a skill born from long apprenticeships where presence was as crucial as dialogue. One of the less visible supporting figures, perhaps positioned near the entrance or exit of the space, engages in an action that is purely organizational, neatly stacking several empty paper cups or ensuring a cable is neatly tucked away. This mundane act of restoring order serves as a counter-rhythm to the emotional entropy dominating the frame. This individual likely possesses a professional history rooted in logistics, stage management, or production coordination, where the maintenance of surface order is paramount, regardless of the drama unfolding in front of them. Their practical focus highlights the degree to which the central crisis is being compartmentalized by those in control of the physical space. When the protagonist's voice does rise above a murmur, the timbre suggests dryness and strain. Yet there is an underlying resonance that hints at a powerful speaking voice suppressed by circumstance. This suppression is more effective than outright screaming because it forces the audience to lean in, straining to catch the barely audible words, thereby investing more cognitive energy into the meaning. This recalls the intensity of early dramatic recordings, where vocal power had to be conveyed through inflection alone, without the benefit of wide dynamic range afforded by modern recording techniques. The film concludes this particular segment not with a fade out or a cut, but with the camera slowly, almost imperceptibly, pulling back, increasing the distance between the lens and the subject, while simultaneously holding focus. This withdrawal of the camera is not a relief, it's an indictment. It conveys that the documentation is continuous and perhaps unending, leaving the protagonist smaller in the frame, more isolated against the oppressive background elements. The director deliberately denies the viewer the comfort of closure, instead leaving them with the enduring image of a person trapped within a documented, inescapable present, their emotional state rendered permanent by the unblinking eye of the recording device. The lingering resonance of the scene is heavily indebted to the director's established penchant for exploring moral ambiguity, a thematic thread often woven through their earlier, more overtly stylized works that referenced European philosophical cinema. Here, however, the ambiguity is stripped bare of artifice. The deliberate flatness of the acting from the peripheral figures functions as a negative space, forcing the protagonist's emotional peaks into stark relief. These supporting individuals are not merely props. They represent the objective, perhaps indifferent, apparatus surrounding the intensely subjective experience of the central figure. The protagonist's gaze, when not directed at the camera, is often aimed slightly above the heads of those around them, suggesting an internal negotiation with unseen forces or perhaps a desperate search for an escape vector that the physical space denies. This upward sweep of the eyes, often associated with characters struggling with immense guilt or existential dread, indicates a mind desperately trying to externalize an internal pressure cooker. An actor specializing in portraying tortured intellectual figures, perhaps with a background in highly rigorous academic or classical training, would rely on this subtle vertical tension to convey the battle between the rational mind and overwhelming emotion. The visual signature of the recording is further complicated by the presence of reflections, a faint glare off a nearby glass surface, or the ghostly image of the camera operator superimposed momentarily on a polished piece of wood. These accidental incursions of the recording process into the narrative frame are not errors. They are reminders that the act of looking is itself a distortion. This layering of images speaks to a directorial fascination with the politics of surveillance, echoing the unsettling self-awareness found in cinematic critiques of post-war totalitarianism, where the private sphere was perpetually under threat. The clothing of the main character, particularly the way the fabric bunches around the shoulders during moments of deep stillness, seems to physically embody constraint. It's not just ill-fitting, it appears to resist the body's natural attempt at relaxed posture, suggesting that even the garments are complicit in the documentation. This level of detail implies a production design process that went beyond simple costume selection, aiming instead to create an environment where every physical object subtly contributes to the sense of entrapment, a concept championed by stage designers favoring symbolic over naturalistic representation. Ultimately, the emotional weight of the footage rests on the protagonist's ability to sustain a performance under duress that must feel entirely spontaneous to the viewer. The slight unevenness in their speech, a sudden shift from breathy low tones to moments of surprising, almost sharp clarity, is the ultimate betrayal of training. It is the moment the carefully constructed persona cracks, revealing the raw material beneath. The film leaves us not with the satisfaction of understanding the event, but with the unsettling recognition of the sheer, exhausting labor required to simply exist under intense, documented scrutiny. The atmosphere is thick with the unspoken contract between the documented and the documenter. The director's career, often marked by an unflinching gaze upon institutional power structures, finds its purest expression here through the sheer impotence of the subject. There is a sense that the entire scenario is a controlled experiment in human breaking points, and the protagonist is the primary variable being tested. This resonates with the cold, observational detachment found in some early conceptual art pieces, where the human subject was placed in deliberately stressful, yet sterile, environments. The protagonist exhibits a telling habit, repeatedly glancing at their own hand as if verifying its physical reality, or perhaps checking for some invisible mark left by the preceding events. This self-scrutiny is a profound indicator of dissociation, a sign that the internal monologue is struggling to reconcile external perception with felt reality. For an actor known for highly internalized, psychologically complex roles, perhaps someone whose early training involved deep immersion in Chekhovian tragedy, demanding absolute belief in the character's internal suffering, this reliance on tactile verification is a desperate, almost primal attempt to re-anchor themselves in the moment. The ambient noise, when briefly audible, always seems to originate from just outside the immediate physical confines of the room. A distant siren, the muffled clatter of machinery. This spatial auditory language emphasizes that while the drama is intensely focused on the immediate subjects, the external world continues unaffected, indifferent to the high-stakes internal reckoning taking place. This technique positions the recording space as a temporary, artificial vacuum, highlighting the protagonist's temporary removal from the flow of normal existence. One observer, seated lowest in the visual hierarchy of the frame, maintains an attitude of almost beatific patience. Their face is largely obscured, but the slight tilt of the head suggests rapt attention, not judgment. This figure might represent the ultimate voyeur, someone deriving intellectual or aesthetic pleasure from the unfolding breakdown, whose professional life may have involved curating or archiving emotionally charged material, thereby developing a high tolerance for witnessing distress without emotional investment. Their stillness is a passive form of complicity, representing the audience's own necessary distance. The composition often deliberately places the protagonist slightly off-center, leaning toward the empty space in the frame. This compositional imbalance is not accidental. It visually communicates instability. The slight lean suggests an outward pressure being applied, perhaps by the unseen forces controlling the documentation, forcing the subject into a position where they are perpetually about to fall out of the frame altogether. This architectural metaphor, the feeling of being perpetually unbalanced, is the film's most effective tool for conveying the erosion of agency. The entire frame functions as a trap, beautifully and brutally rendered through the unforgiving clarity of its low-fidelity capture. The texture of the captured light itself begins to feel heavy, almost viscous, clinging to the contours of the figures in a way that denies crisp delineation. This lack of visual separation between subject and environment suggests a blurring of boundaries that mirrors the narrative confusion. When the director previously worked on large-scale historical dramas, they relied on controlled diffusion and large lighting rigs. Here, the reliance on minimal, practical light sources speaks to a defiant rejection of that controlled artifice, embracing the shadows as co-characters in the drama. The protagonist's facial musculature, particularly around the jawline, shows persistent tension that overrides even moments of purported calm. This tightness is not the tension of fear, but the relentless strain of sustained performance under pressure, the physical manifestation of maintaining a narrative identity while internally grappling with its potential dissolution. This level of nuanced physical acting suggests an actor deeply versed in the principles of physical theater, where the body communicates volumes even when the voice is silenced, perhaps drawing on methodologies that emphasize deep core engagement to sustain complex emotional postures over extended periods. There is a noticeable, albeit brief period, where the recording device seems to wobble slightly, perhaps due to the operator shifting their weight uncomfortably. This small technical tremor introduces a fleeting sense of mutual vulnerability. The operator, usually an invisible entity, becomes momentarily perceptible as a fallible human being, sharing the burden of observation. For a cameraman whose previous work might have involved gritty war correspondence, this brief moment of imbalance suggests that even seasoned professionals find certain intimate recordings ethically taxing, blurring the line between documentation and violation. The background dialogue, previously indistinct chatter, occasionally sharpens just enough for the audience to catch a single, banal word. A mundane phrase like, "check the time," or "is that finished?" These stray fragments of normal conversation, jarringly juxtaposed against the high emotional stakes of the central figure, serve to amplify the isolation. They highlight that while the protagonist is experiencing a significant life-altering moment, the machinery of the recording and the environment around them proceed with routine, creating a profound sense of being suspended outside the natural flow of time and consequence. The enduring impression left by this footage is one of necessary endurance rather than narrative progression. The emotional climax is not an explosion, but a slow, pressurized seep. The director skillfully avoids traditional narrative peaks, favoring the sustained plateau of discomfort. This strategy ensures that the audience processes the scene not as entertainment, but as an unavoidable confrontation with exposed humanity. The film succeeds by refusing to edit the pain into digestible segments, insisting instead that the viewer share the duration of the exposure, making the act of watching an act of empathetic trespass. The periphery of the frame is populated by artifacts that speak volumes about the nature of the documentation itself. A tangled bundle of black cables snakes across the floor, their very presence a reminder of the technological apparatus tethering the subject to this moment. These cables are not hidden. They are openly displayed, functioning as visual chains that bind the protagonist to the recording process. A director keenly aware of semiotics would use this deliberately untidy arrangement to symbolize the entanglement of personal life with the mediated public eye, a visual metaphor for the inescapable presence of the record. The secondary figure whose gaze was previously fixed upon a digital device now slowly, almost deliberately, covers the screen with one hand, obscuring whatever data they were monitoring. This gesture is loaded with subtle implication. Either the information gathered has reached a critical threshold, necessitating a shift in focus, or they are extending a momentary, perhaps performative, act of mercy by blocking the cold light of the monitor from reflecting onto the lead. This movement, so minimal yet so consequential, suggests a character whose training lies in covert operations or high-level strategic planning, where the timing of information disclosure is paramount to control. The protagonist's breathing, which had settled into a strained rhythm, begins to adopt a shallow, quick pattern again, but this time it is accompanied by a barely perceptible rocking motion of the head, a tic often seen in individuals undergoing sensory overload. This involuntary physical response suggests that the accumulated weight of observation, the silent judgment, the cold efficiency of the observers, the abrasive light, is beginning to override their practiced emotional defenses. It is the body betraying the facade of professional composure, a raw, biological response to sustained artificial stress. When the lead figure finally attempts a direct verbal articulation of their internal state, the voice is startlingly low in pitch, almost subterranean, forcing the audience to strain against the ambient hiss of the recording. This vocal choice is an inversion of expected distress. Rather than escalating volume, they retreat into sonic invisibility. This maneuver often indicates a profound sense of learned helplessness, the realization that amplifying one's voice will only invite more scrutiny, not necessarily more understanding. It suggests a history where speaking truth too loudly resulted in severe repercussions, forcing them to communicate only in whispers, audible only to those deemed worthy or powerful enough to listen. The film creates a sense of temporal suspension by never offering a clear shot of any clock or external marker of time. The ambiguity of duration is a key tool in heightening psychological tension. The audience feels trapped in the moment alongside the subject because there is no visual cue signaling an impending break or conclusion. This deliberate narrative stasis, favored by filmmakers focused on ontological dread, forces the viewer into a state of empathetic endurance, making the very passage of time within the frame feel like an active form of endurance required of both the actor and the witness. The cumulative effect is a portrait of a person being slowly excavated, their professional shell peeled away not by violence, but by relentless, documented attention. The air in the confined space appears visually denser, almost particulate, as if the sheer volume of unspoken tension has solidified the atmosphere. This effect is not purely environmental. It seems to be a visual manifestation of the lead character's emotional output, a sort of visible aura of psychic strain that refracts the already weak light sources. A director steeped in the visual language of social realism, particularly that which focuses on poverty or institutional decay, understands that desperation can alter the very visibility of space, turning breathable air into a tangible obstacle. The protagonist's eyes, frequently darting between the observers and an unseen spot on the ceiling, betray a deep, almost philosophical exhaustion rather than simple fear. There's a profound weariness etched around the orbital bones, suggesting an extended period of sleeplessness or intense mental calculation preceding this documented moment. This is the look of someone who has already fought the internal battle and lost, now simply enduring the consequences. An actor who has immersed themselves in method preparation, perhaps studying the long-term physiological effects of moral compromise, would channel this specific hollowed-out gaze. The secondary figure, maintaining organizational control over the equipment, now performs a slow, deliberate wipe of a nearby surface with a cloth, an act of fastidious cleanliness performed in the midst of emotional wreckage. This obsessive attention to physical tidiness acts as a psychological defense mechanism, a frantic attempt to impose order where none exists. This individual's rigid adherence to protocol suggests a background in fields where absolute environmental control is necessary for success, perhaps as a high-level laboratory technician or an archival preservationist, where contamination or disarray is anathema to their professional identity. When the lead character speaks again, the articulation is punctuated by involuntary swallowing, a visible effort to moisten a throat tightened by stress hormones. This small biological failure is more revealing than any carefully chosen word. It implies a systemic breakdown. The body is failing to support the facade the mind is trying to maintain. This raw, physiological display is antithetical to polished performance, serving as a stark reminder that beneath any professional veneer, the human machine is susceptible to collapse under extreme, sustained scrutiny. The use of sound in these quieter moments is